Hi, I'm Aruna.
And I'm Shankar.
We're desperate parents. We have a high schooler at home who doesn't know what career choice he should make. And like all teenagers, he communicates only in grunts and shrugs. So we decided we'll have to do the talking. In this podcast series, we'll interview experts from various fields and ask them questions that takes you into their life, gives you a sense of what their work is really like and how their field is developing.
So one week we could be speaking with someone who teaches aerospace engineering, the next week with a practicing lawyer, and the third with the head of a research lab. And we plan to go beyond these conventional career choices. For example, who wouldn't want to hear the life story of the chef at a five-star restaurant, how he got where he got, for example.
And along the way, we'll also share a nugget or two about decision making, maybe a tool or a mental model that helps while making any choice. We hope this will be useful.
Our guest today is Chamu Kuppuswamy, who holds a doctorate in law from the University of Sheffield in England. She was a lecturer in law at the same university for more than 6 years and is currently University Research Theme Champion for the Global Economy at the University of Hertfordshire, also in England. Welcome to the show, Chamu.
Thank you. Nice to be on the show.
Chamu, I would like to start with an existential question, as it were. Can a high school student really be ready to study law at 18? I mean, what kinds of students do you get? Do you have students who really know that they want to study law, or is it that they just, chance upon it and then continue down that journey?
It's a good question because we do get a good mix of them in terms of students who have chosen it because they've been inspired by things around them. They might have seen a crime drama or they have certain ideas of what the law is. And then we have students who have studied law, civics or politics or something of that shade. So they certainly, I have to say, better prepared. In the first semester, they have difficulties, and then after that, they are quicker to catch on. So I do have to say that, it's important to be aware if you come into a law degree without having had any introduction to what this subject is, it does come as a big surprise because it is usually very different to what you imagine it to be because your introduction perhaps is only through fictitious law.
So I'll just extend that a bit further. Is it possible for a science student with no exposure to the law to suddenly take to a study of the law?
Very good question. There are transferable skills, right? At the end of the day, law is but a science of society, or in other words, it's like a scientific approach. So clarity of thinking, if that's a forte of a school student, then the route is clearly law. And then some areas in law actually are very suited to a science student. In fact, you do need a science degree for those areas of law. And increasingly, those areas of law are also being offered at the undergraduate level. So I'm thinking of intellectual property law, for example. So if you do want to specialize in the area of patents, then you do need to understand chemistry, how to patent a drug, for example. You do need to understand engineering, how to patent a new wind turbine model or parts of an wind turbine model. So it's essential, in fact, to have a knowledge of science, which if you later on, without the knowledge of science, want to become a patent attorney, you specialize or you learn the science side of things. Other than that, apart from intellectual property, there are areas of law where you need to understand evidence quite a lot. So let us say that some students are good in mathematics. There's a lot of financial crime and fraud, and a lot of that's due diligence and risk litigation is all based on how much you understand about, equations and sums and how that is combined with computation, etc. So, being a science student certainly is very, very transferable for its basic skills.
So let me just extend that further. What are the character or personality traits that would equip a student, or what do the best law students have in terms of those character and personality traits?
I think one is certainly a doggedness. Okay, you really need to want to, get down to the bottom of something. If someone actually is persistent about something, I think that's a good thing for the law. because we have to drill down. It's not just what the rule says. You need to know how the rule was formed in order to be able to, serve a client who has a particular problem, so that you will be able to find or frame an argument based on something deeper than what just the rules say or how a previous court has interpreted it. So doggedness and perseverance, till everything about the matter is clear, nothing is kind of left loose or nothing is left fudgy. So yeah, I suppose it's a bit of, investigativeness. That's one thing. I guess another trait would be patience. Law is something, it's the long run. Okay, law and justice, in fact, which really is the unseen driver of law, is very much that you can only get with perseverance and patience. So you need to have the focus to be able to stay with it for a while. So I think these are some of the characteristics that you can develop. I'm not saying that you cannot develop. In fact, study of the law will also help you develop this. So you might get hooked onto it because you saw a crime drama. But if you're passionate about, that in terms of, I really want to do this and, end up being someone like that, then you also develop some of these characteristics because you're so focused on getting to your end point.
Chamu, one of the things we assume about law, and again, it could well be, after seeing crime dramas or, movies, is that anyone who studies law has to be a good public speaker, has to be very strong with arguments and logic and all of these kinds of things. Is there space for introverts in the legal profession?
That's interesting. In fact, I think the legal profession is made for introverts, okay? Because the majority of time you actually spend away from people. Now, if my definition or understanding of introverts are correct, then spending time with books, spending time buried in documents. Like since this morning, I have read about, circa 500 pages, okay? And I haven't spoken to anyone. And I haven't, but that's also the time of the year that you're talking to me means that I'm doing this as well. So I think, it's a good place for introverts. Now, I do need to go and showcase this for some purpose outside. If I was a judge, I would need to give the result of why I read those 500 pages. Or if I was a litigator, I would need to go and show. Or if I am, as I am, a researcher and an analyst and a teacher, I do need to lecture about it. But then those are highly structured. And the fact that I've spent so many hours behind me in books and being by myself clarifying things, I can actually go and speak to anyone, irrespective of whether there's someone there or not. And increasingly in the online world, that's also the case. I don't know who my audience necessarily is. I write and speak and I don't know who's watching me or who's. So in fact, increasingly, it's actually a place for introverts.
Just curious, what got you into law, Chamu? We talked about a lot of the attributes. Is it the attributes, or did you always know you wanted to do law?
No, I had no idea. I really had no idea that I wanted to do law because I didn't study law as a subject in school. So I did a CBSE syllabus. I actually had an affinity towards languages. And in fact, up until my 12th standard, I studied in India, right? I did not let go of my second language, so you didn't need to do that. Your public exam 12th standard, you didn't need to do an extra language, but I chose to keep it. So I think that affinity to language really played out. And rather, the language that I was quite interested in was Hindi, but that doesn't matter. It's really about concepts that we deal in language, which is again the mainstay of law as well. So that was my attraction to law.
You mentioned the 500 pages you'd read today. Now, a lot of students are intimidated by the amount of reading and assimilation that the study of law seems to demand. How valid is their concern?
150% valid. That's the trade-off, okay? You, as a lawyer, you're all about depth. You need full understanding, okay? So there are many techniques, though. That's, in fact, 70% of the study of law. Is techniques to deal with material. Yeah, 500 pages looks like a monolith and looks massive to start with. And I didn't start off like this either. Okay. Along the way, I have developed it because it's come organically and naturally, wasn't forced. It was because of my other characteristics that I've ended up doing this bulk. So that's the main thing to remember. Nobody comes prepared to deal with 500 pages, even if it is, a language that you're so familiar with. And I had the advantage of being super, comfortable with English, but you've got to think about many students around the world in law do not actually speak English, but they actually study in English. Okay, so, and they too get to the point where 500 pages a day is easy, because developing techniques for it is important. And you'll crack that, sometime or the other. But I have to say, there's no shortcut around it, because without a shortcut, you get the full satisfaction. With shortcut, it's going to be, short-term gratification, which is not going to last.
So you teach. How do you make the study of law interesting?
Oh, that's actually not that difficult, because life is law, law is life. Legal problems start with real people. Okay, legal problems don't start at the point of, let me make a rule. So all our subjects are designed around either a person or an organization. So if I take, criminal law, for example, it is because someone has suffered an injury of some sort. And you need to go to the law to look at, how do we classify injuries that are sustained? How do you identify who could potentially be responsible? So it really starts as a very lived experience. And even with institutions, it's not that distant, because what you're looking at is, okay, it's not a person, but then we have got, there is some blue dye running in this river. Now, who's done that? It's not, the house that's next to the river. It's probably coming from those buildings that are producing certain products. And then you start looking at, well, what is the problem with it? What is the problem if there is a blue streak in the river? So it's very organic in terms of, how you teach law, because it's all around us. It, pervades us. So every legal subject has a starting point in a lived experience. So it's easy in that sense to teach. But as a student, sometimes for some areas of law, you do need a lot of life experience. So I've just come out of supervising a student this morning who's tackling an issue in land law. Now, this or property law. Again, terminologies are something you have to get your head around. This is a student who, he's a student, never bought a property, never sold a property, etc. So lived experience will help a little better. There are a couple of students who are older in the class who have bought a property, sold a property, and immediately are able to start at a different level of understanding. Yeah. So some areas of law tend to work like that as well. Teaching those, again, takes a longer time. And this is where the characteristic of staying on with something. It's not an instant, 30-second, 40-second, I wouldn't say TikTok-y, because there's a lot of things you can do with law on TikTok as well. But that's the thing. It's about, is it instantly kind of relatable, or is it something that I'll have to, provide a lot of background to?
Now, the law seems to be country specific. So do you have any advice to students on how they can geography proof, as it were, their legal training?
Yeah, I find that term quite funny, geography proof, because that's in fact the reason why we make a lot of money as well as lawyers. That's because every geography has a different law. And therefore you need our services in order to be able to bridge that territorial or jurisdictional divide, as we call it. Okay, so that's bread and butter for us lawyers. And some subjects are even built on that. There's a subject called private international law, which is basically about which law applies. And that's really what private international law is. So, for example, let's say that, I grew up in India, I got married in India, then I want to adopt a child in Britain. Now we're looking at, well, which law actually applies? So there's a whole area of law. So, I would say, first of all, you need to be able to understand more than one geography of law. Okay, that's going to be your USP. So you develop your USP based on how skilled you are in different geographies, but as well understanding that there are certain geographies that are similar to what you have studied in your first degree, second degree, your experience, and there are certain others that aren't. Yeah. So if they are similar, then you will only take maybe 3-4 months. Let's say that you are, an in-house lawyer, or, starting out as an in-house lawyer in a company in India. Now they are expanding their operation, let us say, into Malaysia, and you need to be looking at, well, what is the privacy related laws in Malaysia such that the data that I hold in my company can be shared. What you then need to think about is Malaysia a civil law jurisdiction or a common law jurisdiction? If it's a common law jurisdiction, you studied law in India, and therefore you're not going to take more than a month and a half to be able to get up to speed with what their law is. Whereas at the same time, you have to give yourself way more time if it is going to be China, which is a civil law jurisdiction. So having said that, this is a fundamental characteristic of law. But there are some areas, and I suppose this is what you are alluding to in your question about geography proofness, which apply across the board. So one area that I specialize in is public international law. This is not something students, usually straight away specialize in, and I didn't do it as well. I only specialized in it in my master's. This is to do with law between countries, treaties, climate change, war, etc. Now, this is the most geography proof because the law itself is about how countries have got together to make a common law between them for specific subjects. Okay, so if you study public international law, I teach exactly the same thing for Russia, for China, for Somalia, for Papua New Guinea. It's exactly the same thing. Okay, but that's a very niche subject, and there aren't that many practitioners, if you like, in that area of law. I mean, even in London, there are about 10 chambers, which is probably 1-2% of the chambers that specialize in public international law. But there's another area which cuts across jurisdictions and boundaries because it's more what we call private law. And this is mainstay of a lot of legal professionals, is dispute resolution. So alternate forms of dispute resolution. Commercial arbitration is one of the big ones in that. You can choose London to be the forum, and then you can be an arbitrator. Okay. I mean, having said that, the common stuff is the rules of arbitration, but then you do need to know some of the laws that apply to the companies or individuals that are the parties to the dispute. Okay. So yeah, you do need to have strengths in different jurisdictions, but some areas of law you will be able to do. Intellectual property is another area, increasingly becoming more harmonized, but then it's a very complex area. But in India, I believe there's a lot of scope for growth for intellectual property. Many firms, especially I think based in Bombay, there's traditionally been a few in Delhi, but that's expanding. But then the Chennai is where the appeals court for intellectual property is based. There are firms that are, developing in the south as well. I don't know the latest. There could be potentially firms in Bangalore as well because of the, concentration of high tech or science tech stuff that may be going on over there. So yeah, that's a growth area, I believe.
Chamu, staying with geography, looking at it from the employment point of view. In recent years, the techies have had, all countries welcoming them with visa. Mobility has been a lot easier as a techie. How does that work with law, with lawyers?
Yeah, there has been no perceptible change, I mean, lawyers have always been moving around. I mean, even in India, Mahatma Gandhi was a lawyer, and he moved, from Gujarat to South Africa, came to London, then came back. So for law, I think mobility has been, it's a very old story. Lawyers move around quite a lot. There is the International Law Association, which is the association of law professionals around the world, which really demonstrates that, you would have a Syrian lawyer who's there in Australia, doing law. So it's an old story. So in terms of whether this has actually opened up and whether there are numbers moving around, there has been, some increase, but there's not been significant change like, the techies that you're talking about, because there's no particular structural change that has required it to happen. Technology has progressed, right? And therefore you have techies and in fact, I think many techies do come across, for example, to work here in England, mainly because of legal restraints. We can't share our data with, India, because if you're working there, you don't have the same legal protections as we do with, our data. So it's worked that way, but it's not really worked to increase, employability in ways. But however, with the general mobility and increase in globalization, the economic globalization certainly attracts more of, legal movement of people as well.
And I guess in absolute terms, there probably are much fewer lawyers than techies. So it may not be so perceptible.
Possible as well. I mean, going by the number of law students, it seems like there are quite a number of law students. But if I do compare, I mean, just to think of the stats from my own university, the computer science department, the law department, this computer science department overall has comparable number of students, but in terms of international students, especially students from India, computer science, wins hands down compared to students in the law school. So overall, yes, I think there will be lesser law students. Mainly because I think law students are also, branch out into a lot of other professions.
Okay, we're going to come to that actually in a bit, but I just wanted to ask you, what are the hottest areas in law today?
Hottest. Okay, not a term I would use for law, but
most exciting.
Okay, let me use the radar of what my students are doing this year in terms of what they seem interested to research into and know more about, and choose as optional subjects that they want to choose, because it's a choice for them. Some subjects they can choose. One is certainly around AI and regulation. So how to understand, where to get a grip on this. Although I have to say that a lot of the work a lot of the discussions around that are still not reached very interesting levels in the legal circle. It all seems to be a bit ethical, and it all seems to be a bit of, more competition-based rather than interesting legal discussion. So from that perspective, I keep telling my students, come up with something more interesting, although there is a lot of potential for that. So for some time, the data protection side has been a hot area. A lot of students choose to come to study law here in our courses because they want to study more about how data can be protected, because there are a lot of jobs around that. And they also find it interesting in terms of, how to protect privacy, or what are the legal frameworks of protecting privacy. Another area, which is really interesting, I think, for some students with a certain bent, is drone warfare. How to regulate drone warfare. What are the rules around the humanitarian law, and how drone warfare is it fit for purpose? So this is a really interesting question. To some extent, it also, marries up with artificial intelligence in the sense, the future of war and artificial intelligence. An area that I think, has become slightly less trendy, but that's only because we have some very jazzy topics around at the moment, is around the medical side or biotechnology side, and looking at how, things like, surrogacy or assisted suicide, very different laws in many different countries. So how do you regulate that? What are the interests? And then going on from that, there is the sort of evergreen human rights side of things, which is certainly an option for those, extroverts who really want to be out there, almost combining, activism with the rights and the law. But then I've saved the best, I think, for the last, which is law and climatology, law and climate science. Or in other words, a new form of environmental law that is more fit for the epoch of the Anthropocene. And this is certainly going to, subsume a lot of the areas I've been talking about so far. It could subsume AI. It could subsume, data protection, privacy, all of that as well. So it could subsume, and we come back in a way full circle to some of the fundamental issues around law. Has always dealt with ownership, right? If you own something, you can do anything that you want, whether it's a house or whether it's data, so those are fundamental philosophical questions. And almost all of these varieties of law really hinge on that sort of, ownership. So for those who really want to go deeply into this, perhaps, even eventually do a PhD or immerse themselves into reforming the law or getting justice, It's that sort of stuff that they should be thinking about.
So yeah, about going deeper, in something like the medical profession, for example, just doing a medical degree nowadays doesn't seem to be enough. There's further layers of specialization. How is it in law? Can, students finish their undergraduate degree and hope to be able to work, or is it become essential that you have to specialize in intellectual property or environmental law or something like that?
No. In fact, an undergraduate degree, taking the options, is quite sufficient even now, because you will learn along as you go. And then you might want to do a master's or a PhD, but it's nothing like the medical profession. The undergraduate degree is sufficient because it covers a lot of things. It covers what we call the core disciplines, contract, tort, property, constitution, public, criminal. So that's the core side. And then we also have, I think almost any university will have nearly 2 years worth of optional subjects in which you can cover all of this that I've mentioned so far, whether it's IP or medical ethics or law of warfare, or you can cover, everything, environmental, oil and gas law. You can cover all of that in the optional. So I think with the models I know, 3+3, I think in India that still holds. There's our first undergraduate degree and a second 3-year degree, or you can do the combined degree, which is a 5-year degree. All of these options will allow for, a good base in starting off your career and, progressing even without having a specialization, to be honest.
So I don't know how it is in the UK, but here we hear quite a lot about the low-paid grind that beginners are put through. Is this true across the board here, to the best of your knowledge, or in the UK? And how do newly minted lawyers cope with this? What's your advice to them?
They should be thankful that AI is coming our way, because I really do hope that AI will take away all of this, what we call deviling, which means doing a lot of work for no money. Again, that has a long history in law. Okay, I don't know if we even originated it, but it's something that you are expected to. You learn in the job, you get that experience, the usual stuff that's said, I'm not going to give you money, but I'll give you opportunity to learn, that sort of stuff. But yes, it's true. There is a lot of legwork. There is a lot of, what paralegals do. So you're going to have to find a way of coping with it. You're going to have to devise a strategy, or, don't do that work, choose other things. I mean, academia is one where right from, day one, you decide what your agenda is, So a huge amount of independence that you get, you use it up to do what's interesting for you, okay? So in law, you have the option of developing that sort of independent practice. If you're in practice, or if you're in academia, you have your own agenda. But if you are servicing clients in terms of, being part of an office that does litigation, yes, you're going to have to learn the ropes, as it is called, through that grind. That's where I say I think AI is going to be a savior. You don't have to go and find, spend 5 hours in the library finding out that case law from 1876. So
there are various options, right? You become a lawyer, or you join the legal department of a company, or you teach. Probably are many, many options. Do you have anything to say for students who may be weighing these options? Obviously, you can't say one is better than the other, but how should they prepare for making such a decision?
I think multiple factors will come into play, right? You might have some things that are like red lines, meaning I am not going to move out of Chennai, okay? Then that sets certain things for you. So I think to a certain extent, start like that, that I certainly don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. Keep that. Then beyond that, make sure you are, you perceive that all doors are open to you, okay? Because in law, there is still a lot of, it's not like perhaps some other professions, there is a lot of, it's quite closed. You might still need recommendations. You might still, perhaps even more than, some other professions. So because of that, there may be perceptions of elitism, okay? So you might think, oh, maybe I might not go to, chambers doing public international law, or fighting for a council, representing India in the Security Council, representing India in the International Court of Justice. Okay, so don't close those doors for you, because I think in 2025, that's something I would advise. So look at various options. look for a non-governmental organization that works in, that's trying to work protecting tribal rights or protecting a forest, for example. Don't think of that as being too risky, because nowadays there are a lot of networks and the jobs in that keep coming, one after the other. But there is some sort of, maybe little less stability. So now you've got to think about whether I want stability, whether I really want a job for life, or whether I want to do. So don't discount your civil society organization strand. Look for those, in which case then you have to look for specific places in India, specific regions in the world, which is invested in that sort of work. Don't, again, close the door for in-house counsel saying, that's going to be, I'm working for the devil. Sometimes students, especially law students who are very, passionate about, I want justice, might think that is the case. But actually, you need to be on the inside in order to be able to change the corporate practice. Let's say about, I'm not rubbishing Coca-Cola, but that's a very popular example. They take a lot of water, and it's how do you get environmental law to, work to get them to comply in certain ways or change the practice? So that there is that option as well. When you go for a job, the job inherently doesn't, lead you to doing things that are against your values. Okay, because as children especially, you can be very stuck on saying, if this is the face of something, then they might be in a certain way. Keep an open mind in that sense, right? So explore the whole spectrum: non-governmental, private sector, academia, public service, or even something independent. Because there are a lot of fact checkers, for example, with legal skills. They're very, very good fact checkers, and you need that, because you do need to understand documents in small print if you're doing fact checking and stuff. So they may be some of the newer type of, law options that are available.
You touched on values. I just wanted to check something about this whole moral angle, right? Whether it's for journalism or medical profession or teaching, there is a moral angle to it. Here, obviously, it's very stark, the idea of justice. For students thinking about this as a profession, what would you say? I mean, you could argue that you should have a strong moral core, but on the other hand, you could also argue that, keep all of that aside and look at the facts and the logic. How would you have them think about this?
Well, I think there's two levels of moral code, right? One is to, do the job properly. To the best of your knowledge, you need to make sure that you are, discharging your role in that position. So that's one level of moral code. The other level of moral code is, how is my job even making me complicit with things that I perhaps don't believe in, right? I think increasingly now, I do see a lot of my students across various age groups, feeling that certain types of jobs makes them complicit, for example, in environmental plunder, or certain types of jobs, puts monetary benefit above the value of life. Okay. And I think that, if you get that feeling of that sort of, meta level moral narrative as being important, then I think it's important that you do need to be careful which profession, which position you're going to be taking up. Okay. To be honest, the academia is, in that sense, the most independent, because I can choose to, advise a company. I can choose. So that means if you're not very sure from the moral angle, this is a place to park yourself, because you can change course as well. But at the same time, I have to tell you that there is so much of managerialism in most jobs at the moment that you might not necessarily, need to activate your moral compass at some point, because it's about the systems working in a certain way. But this might be too complex for students to consider at this point. It might only be for one or two of those who really are, having a dilemma. But otherwise, don't take it too deep. What's important is, if you're working as an in-house lawyer, make sure that you are up to date with your legal practice knowledge. So, for example, there was a student of mine who passed out of the course about 3 years ago. And just last year, he got back in touch with me and he said, do you know what the latest is in terms of writing climate, taking into account climate considerations in contracts? And that's when, and I appreciated his urge to actually do something when he was actually drafting a contract for a mining company. And I was able to direct him saying, look, there is a new, or rather recently published, what's known as contract playbook. There are clauses in the contract that you can pick, whether you want to include more sustainability, whether you want to include more of human rights consciousness. So why don't you actually refer that, pick up a clause, then initiate a conversation within your team, and then go your senior management team and get them to accept. So that's how you actually now deepen your practice, but at the same time, you're sharpening your moral compass as well, and understanding how people around you in that team think about including the sustainability clause. But fundamentally, it comes down to the point of doing your job really properly, right?
Yeah.
He's a contract lawyer, 3 years into his job, but he's updating himself of what the latest is. Because a lot of us in research and academia are always, doing stuff which are cutting edge. But then it's a question of whether those in practice are taking it up and applying it. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to, get the benefits of those things. So ultimately, if you want to have your moral compass right, work really hard to update yourself on the area of law, and then see if there's a change that's needed.
One of the things we've observed is that lawyers often tend to be at the top of many other professions, politicians in the corporate world and in other areas. Very often you see that, there are lawyers at the top. What is it about the study of law that prepares them for leadership?
I think it's the power of knowledge, because I always think that if you do law, you always do more than one subject, because you certainly have to have a grip on, various activities in society, right? So if you're doing criminal law, you certainly need to understand how crime is committed, okay? What are the mechanics of how things are done? So it's almost like a criminal lawyer can actually be a criminal as well as a criminal lawyer. Now, pun not intended, okay, especially if I'm talking to, an Indian audience. Similarly, if I'm a medical lawyer, then I do understand to a large extent how, what the particular operation is that is done by a surgeon, and what are the points in which they're good at and where they actually could. So because of that, you get a sense of, I know how things work, whether it's organization or whether it is society or whether it is life. And with experience, that then turns into, well, I think, I can tell you how things might work. Maybe do it like that, do it like this. So that way your organic leadership skills start developing, right? But then you have to be very, very responsible beyond that, because I see a lot of, lawyers turned other things, not really being that responsible. Okay, so that's really important. With leadership comes responsibility. And I think if you really use your legal acumen in that, transfer profession of yours or particular leadership position, then you can get to being very responsible. But unfortunately, I think that is lacking. So for the generations that are coming, next, it'll be really good if you focus on the responsibility side of, the law, which you will learn a lot about.
Right, I think I know the answer to this one, but we spoke a little bit about the grind that young lawyers go through. But in the long run, would you say this is a financially rewarding profession?
Yeah, I think even the lowest paid legal professional, whatever the job they might be, is higher than some other degree holders, I think. So yeah, from that sense, yes, I mean, there are, especially in the UK, lawyers, especially barristers or in-house lawyers, earn quite a lot in the short run and the long run. And compared to, I think it is. Yeah, I think the answer to your question is yes, in the short run as well as the long run. In the long run, certainly. In the short run, depends on, which particular organization and how the economic interests are tied up with it.
Sure.
What would you say is the coolest thing about law, Chamu?
Perception of others, I think. Because if someone asks you what you're doing, and I say, I have a PhD in law, they're like, wow. So I think that's cool, that they all understand it. So I think law also kind of signifies power. And I think that's cool. Okay, law is a superpower. The only difference between, I guess, on-screen superpower and this is that it matures over a period of time, The power of law really manifests. The more you use it, the more you understand it, the more you sort of, mature in it. So yeah, law is powerful. I think that's kind of what makes it really cool.
Let me close by just asking any words of advice for a high school student considering law? Anything that we haven't discussed that you'd like to share with them?
I think even those not considering law should consider law. And I say this from a bit of a selfish perspective, in the sense we still need really good lawyers, okay, in the sort of complete holistic sense. So I guess the more I encourage more people to go, there will be some gems that can emerge, okay? And that, I think, from my perspective is good, but also those emerge will find it extremely, beneficial. But for those who are considering law, I think try and do get introduced to the law, even if you're not studying it as a subject, or if you're not studying it, even if you're studying allied sort of subjects, because nowadays you don't actually have to spend money to buy a law book or to look at law resources. So you've got resources available, freely accessible on the internet, which are good, authentic sources. Mm-hmm. So do spend some time reading it, finding out the reality of the law, finding out what it actually is, because you cannot substitute even, chats like this about what it is, or, our own perception, to the first-hand experience of picking something up, reading it, seeing how you feel about it. Yeah. And then reflect and introspect on that. If you've read it and if you've got completely excited by it, don't get carried away and think law is for you. Okay. Stop there and figure out, ask yourself the question, what is it that got me excited about it? Now, this is, not a usual thing for someone I'm thinking of, a 17, 18-year-old or 16-year-old to do. But I think that's where the maturity comes. If they are able to do that, and if parents are actually going through the exercise with them, if you find that your child is actually doing this, then I think, you should certainly nudge them quite hard, to going towards law. And if, let's say that, I see many students considering subjects where they use law heavily, management, politics, business, I would ask you to think harder and say, really, if I do law, I have options to do others. But if you do business, management, politics, to do law afterwards is not going to be that easy, because there's a certain bent of mind when you do those subjects. So you might want to change focus and actually come to law. Yeah, and those who are thinking of other subjects.
That's very helpful, Chamu. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Same here. Lovely to connect.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
In today's decision-making segment, we're going to be talking about another cognitive bias called recency bias. Recency bias is also sometimes known as availability bias, and it is a tendency to give a lot of weightage to events that happened recently as compared to events that happened a little earlier. So if you have information in a sequence, you end up giving a lot of weightage and importance to what happened recently. So let's say, for example, you've written several exams over the past few months. You might look at the marks that you've got in the latest exams and, if you've done very well, be overly influenced by that to choose that particular subject, or get pretty dejected if you've done one exam badly. This is obviously not a balanced view. So it's best if you look at all of the information and give it equal weightage and make a decision based on that. That's the best way to avoid recency bias. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. We'll be back soon with another edition of Desperate Parents. Bye.
Bye-bye.